How's it going? All right. Hey, happy Super Bowl Sunday. My name is Trish Davis. I'm one of the pastors here. Interested in knowing who's here today. How many Eagle fans do we have? All right. Just today, my best friend Eve is from Philly. Her whole house, she lives in Nashville, Tennessee, is decked out to the nines. It's hilarious. Who's the one Patriots fan? Okay, we're gonna pray for that soul. That's awesome. If you're new to Hope City, or if you've missed over the past couple weeks, we've been in this series talking about Rise Up. And 2 weeks ago, we had our official grand opening, and Justin, our senior pastor, gave a very powerful message of what it means to rise up from your past. Last week, we talked about rising up from loneliness and the power of community and healthy friendships. And this week, I want to talk about what it means to rise up from fear, right? That's an easy, light topic. And so as we dive into the topic of fear, I thought it would be fun to just kind of figure out kind of how fearful we are as a group of people here today. And so I have a couple questions for you. Just raise your hand if you are fearful of insects, like bugs or spiders completely freak you out. Yeah, you're those people. How many of you are afraid of reptiles? Like if a snake came in right now, you'd be out of here. Okay, lots of you. How many of you are afraid of heights? That would be me. I am so scared of heights. Now, I'll get on like scaffolding and a ladder when I'm painting or a room or something, but I don't do heights. In fact, when Justin and I were dating, I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, and I had not spent a lot of time in central Indiana. And so when I came to visit Justin, he wanted to take me to Turkey Run. And if you've been to Turkey Run, it's this awesome place that you can go canoeing, you can go tubing. And as we were walking in the park, we came across this huge covered bridge that went over the water. Well, this covered bridge had a really large window that had no glass in it. And so we show up to the window, we're all kind of looking down. I'm like, oh my gosh, like my stomach hurt just looking down over the window. And Justin's youngest brother decides that he was gonna jump out of the window. And I was like, that boy is crazy. And so he does it, and as he does it, we realize that there's people below that are cheering him on. It gets their attention. They're like, yeah. And then they look up and they see me. And so Justin's like, you should jump. I'm like, oh my gosh, are you crazy? There's no way. And my brother-in-law's in the water. He's like, do it, Trish. You can do it. I was like, no, I am afraid of heights. Well, then this family that was in a canoe, they pull over and they're like, do it. And then like a couple canoes that had some guys that were pretty much intoxicated were like, do it. And so then I'm standing there at this window going, oh my gosh, peer pressure. I'm going to have to jump. So I get on it, and you know how your knees get really wobbly, and I feel like I'm going to throw up, and I don't even think I jumped. I think Justin pushed me off. I'm just saying. And I was so scared that when I landed, I didn't point my toes. I landed flat-footed. It was horrible. It scarred me for the rest of my life. In fact, I'm still afraid of heights. About 2 years later, when we had Micah, Justin felt like he had to experience Navy Pier, and Navy Pier has this huge, contraption that you go way high up in the air to be able to, it's a Ferris wheel. Yes, it's a contraption. It's not a Ferris wheel. It's a death contraption. And so we get on this Ferris wheel. I cry all the way up to the tippy top, and then I cry all the way to the bottom. And I am holding on to Micah so tightly, he's crying because he can't breathe. I am scared of heights. Okay, clowns. Who's scared of clowns? Yeah, that whole creepy clown thing that we went through of, I don't know, it was really scary. I'm afraid of clowns now. And lastly, who's afraid of airplanes? Anybody? Yeah. So I am afraid of, obviously heights. I'm super afraid of flying. In fact, when Justin and I started traveling around the country sharing our marriage ministry, it kind of meant you had to get on an airplane, and I would be crazy head. Like I would pray and fast days before because I was just so scared of getting on the airplane. I would know the weather pattern all the way from Australia to China to America just to make sure that our plane would be safe. Like super scared. I'm better now, but I will admit this. If I'm in an airplane and it's a little dicey, the weather's getting a little nervous, the plane's a little old, I am kind of known for using inappropriate language. So I'm working on it. But a recent study showed that the number one fear for Americans is that we fear corruption of our government. It's probably not shocking. What's interesting is that it's been the same fear for the past 3 years. The second fear was the fear of a terrorist attack, and number 3 was a fear of not having enough money for the future. Now, I think as I started diving into this whole issue of fear, I started researching, I was blown away when I discovered that psychologists say that no matter where you grew up, your economic status, your culture, that humanity as a whole, that we all struggle with 5 of the same fears. Now listen, when I started to read this list of these 5 fears, I was kind of like, what? This is strange. The first one is this. The first one is extinction. Now, I don't remember being in Bible study and be like, y'all, I need you to pray for me. I'm really nervous about extinction. Like, I'm nervous. But extinction, when you really look at it, is basically the fear of death, that you're afraid to die. Now, the second one is the one that's kind of the most craziest. Number 2 is mutilation. Okay, and so as I was diving into this, it's mutilation has to deal with the fear of like losing the function of a body part, the fear of being physically harmed. It's under this umbrella of fear, mutilation, that we fear bugs, that we fear animals, because it's not the bug or the fear or the animal we fear. We fear what they'll do to our bodies. This teeny tiny spider, right? We just think it's going to take us out. Like, that's that fear. The next one, number 3, is loss of autonomy. And this is the fear of being paralyzed or restricted. This is where claustrophobia would come under this fear. Number 4, a separation, the fear of abandonment, rejection, loss of connectedness. And lastly, number 5 is called ego/death. And this is different than number 1, where you fear bodily death. This is about your emotions. It's about your ego. It's the fear of humiliation and shame, a mechanism that's so profound of disapproval that it threatens you. And I think all of us can find ourselves somewhere in there that we fear. And I don't know about you, but growing up, I grew up a very fearful child. I feared everything. And I think part of it had to do with is I was born into a family with a lot of tragedy. In fact, I would say I was born into tragedy. My mom's parents, as I grew older, I started to understand her story. And when she was in 8th grade, her dad passed away of a heart attack. And then 2 years later, her mom died of breast cancer. And so as my mom's story goes, she has 2 older brothers, a twin sister, and a younger sister. And when her mom passed away, she was separated from them and was taken to live with a distant relative. So death in our family was something that was just a part of our story. And for some reason, growing up, a lot of people that we were close to had deaths. My dad had a brother who passed away. And so in my little girl mind, I always had this fear that something would happen to my family. And then I think for all of us, we get to this stage called middle school. Any middle schoolers here today? Right? You guys are awesome. Praying for you right now. Like, middle school is when I truly believe all of these 5 fears really come into fruition. Like, you feel all of them, experience all of them in middle school. And middle school isn't all that bad. But being in middle school in the 80s, like I was, had its own epic events. In fact, being in middle school in the 80s meant you didn't get to connect with friends via your phone. We did not have cell phones. We did not have Snapchat. The only way we got to talk to our friends was using the phone. If you had 2 phones, you were pretty amazing. But in our house, we had 1 phone. It was in the kitchen. It was attached to the wall. It had a long cord on it. And if you wanted to talk privately, you would answer the phone, and then you would drag the cord somewhere to the closest room, which is usually the bathroom, which is super gross, to talk to your friends. Well, when you're in middle school in the 80s, to have a boyfriend means you had a phone boyfriend. You never really saw each other. You just talked on the phone. It's what you did. And if you talked on the phone to a boy multiple times, he was your phone boyfriend. It was awesome. And so my first phone boyfriend, his name was Keith. And man, our relationship was awesome. It lasted forever, a whole month. It was so fun. And I can't remember why we broke up from being phone girlfriend and phone boyfriend, but we did. And I remember when we broke up, it didn't go very well. I think we were pretty mean to each other. But in middle school, I think it's still true to today. You don't have phone boyfriends because now you guys can Snapchat and you can text. But what we do have is mall girlfriends, right? You show up to the mall with your girlfriend. You either pick her up or you get dropped off together. And what do, girls? We hang out. We have our little dollars that we go and get our smoothie that we really don't drink. Today it would probably be Starbucks. And then we go to Claire's and buy earrings that will fall apart by the end of the week. But why we really go to the mall in the 80s, why we had our mall girlfriends, is hoping that we would see our phone boyfriends, that we'd actually physically get to see them. And so I did just that. Even though Keith and I had broken up, I go to the mall with my girlfriends and we walk around and do what girls do. And then about an hour in, back in those days, the mall had these huge planters that had a whole bunch of plants in them. And then around the plants were circumferenced with seating areas. And where I grew up, you would pick your plant area. That's how hardcore we were. This is like my plant area. And you would sit there with your friends and drink your smoothies and be stupid. And as we were walking, I saw my phone boyfriend, Keith, now that we had broken up, sitting there by one of the planters with his posse. And it's the first time that I can remember being prompted to do something. Can you remember the first time where you knew that you should be doing something and you don't know why, but you just felt prompted to do it? That was this moment, and I felt like I was feeling this prompting to go say something to Keith. And when I looked at him, he looked sad. I mean, honestly, he just looked really sad, and he was kind of sitting off from the rest of his friends. And in the moment that I felt like I should go talk to him, the very next thought and emotion was fear. Because I thought, what if I go and talk to him and he ignores me? Like, what if I go and talk to him and he's mean to me and he embarrasses me in front of all of my friends? And so I just simply walked past him, barely giving him a glance, and that was it. And I remember when I got picked up by my mom, that feeling like I had chosen something wrong. I knew I didn't make the right choice. Have you ever had a moment where you knew that you could step into somebody's life, you could say a kind word, that maybe you could give some encouragement, but fear gets the best of you, and because of fear, you miss out on the opportunity? A week later, I received another phone call, a phone call I never thought I would get in middle school, that Keith had taken his life. That with a single gunshot to his head, he was gone. And death took on a whole new meaning. Shame and guilt took on a whole new meaning. And the thing about fear is that when we lean into fear, it paralyzes you. Fear convinces you that your circumstances are more powerful than your God. And when you live a life of fear, you live life anxiety-filled, always thinking the worst to prepare for the worst. And when we live out of fear rather than out of faith in God, what happens is we feel exhausted all the time. It robs you from a peace and a joy-filled life. And what I've learned over the years of my battle with fear is this, that fear is an invitation to find God. That just because we fear, it cannot and will not negate the truth and the power of who God is in your life. And so when you fear and you look for God, we find him even when we fear our circumstances. We find him even when we fear our relationships. We find him when we fear our worth. And so as I was kind of dissecting fear in itself and learning what psychologists say and thinking about how we fear, what does the Bible say? And the Bible talks about fear over 300 times. And over 80 times it says, do not fear, that the Lord calls out to us, do not be afraid, do not fear, for I am your Lord, your God. And so when I was thinking about the Bible, I kept coming back to this specific book, a story of a queen A story of a queen whose testimony became so powerful, she has her own book in the Bible. It's the story of Queen Esther. And what's interesting about the book of Esther, it is only one of two books where God is never mentioned by name, but yet his work in her life is so evident. And so the book of Esther begins not of a story of a queen, but of a king. And this king, y'all, he's crazy. If you get some time this week, I would love for you to read through the book of Esther. King Xerxes is this powerful king. He is the king that spans over 127 under other kingdoms, all the way from Ethiopia to India. And his kingdom, which is in Persia, is the most dominant of all of them. And this man liked himself a party. He was partying all the time. In fact, it's recorded in Esther, I think one of the most epic party I've ever heard of. But he decides to throw a party for all of his kingdom, so all 127 princes show up, and it lasts for 6 months. That's a lot of wine, y'all. I mean, that is a long time to party. And in the midst of the party, there's this moment where he decides that he wants his queen at the time to come in, and he wants to parade her in front of all the princes. And so he sends a servant to go get her. The servant returns, and she's not there. And he's trying to figure out what is going on. And what we learn about King Xerxes is not only did he like to celebrate, the man liked to collaborate. He could not make a decision on his own. He always brought his bros with him. They always had to discuss what was going on. He always wanted the opinion of other people when it came to kingdom matters. And so when the queen doesn't show up, I just envision him like, come on, let's huddle up, And they just say, you know what? You should tell her to get to stepping. You should kick her out of the kingdom and strip her of her crown. And that's what he does. That's what he does. And they realize that the next couple of days, the king becomes sad over his swift decision. And so they go to him and say, you know what you need to do? You need a new queen. You need a queen who's beautiful, who's young, a queen who is a virgin. He's like, that sounds great. So he sends out this decree that goes out to all 127 kingdoms. Can you imagine getting a letter that says that you are qualified just because of your age, just because of your beauty? And this is where Esther enters the scene. We pick up the story in chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. It says, now there was a citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shishimai, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive were Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Now Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as her own daughter when her father and mother had died. Okay, so there's a lot going in this paragraph, but in a nutshell, the Jewish population that lived in Persia came as refugees. They were exiled from their homeland of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. And now a whole century has gone by and a new generation has risen. A generation that says that they were free to be of wealth. They were free to make a name of themselves. In fact, in the day of Mordecai and Esther, Esther's first name that you hear referenced in this passage is Hadassah. And Hadassah is her Hebrew name. So at some point, they integrated so much that her Hebrew name was changed to a Persian name, the name of Esther. And they were given freedom to be whatever they wanted to be. But I believe that there were still some racial tensions. There were still issues. Because it says in her earlier life, think about Esther, her name is changed. Her family came as refugees. Now her parents have passed away. She has no lineage whatsoever. She's come to live with her cousin Mordecai. And now it says that she's a young girl. This decree goes out that everything is about to change. Now she's about to be taken into human trafficking. Can you imagine? And so Mordecai knows what's coming. Mordecai knows that once Esther enters the palace doors, she is never returning. And so Mordecai pleads with her, Esther, please do not tell the king that you are of Jewish descent. Just keep it to yourself. And she does just that. And then you continue to read kind of the dark story that unfolds, that this king, after girl, would be brought into his private quarters. And if he saw them worthy, they would be upgraded to become one of his wives, to become queen. And that's exactly what happens with Esther. She's chosen. She becomes queen. And I think when we read the Bible, we kind of put end caps on to think she became queen. She made a name for herself. She's going to be the most beautiful, most popular woman in all of the land. Story over. But in Esther's story, it just begins. In Esther's story, we find out that she isn't just queen, but she's going to have to champion a whole people group. As she becomes queen, another man enters the scene, and his name is Haman. And Haman, it's funny, King Xerxes was kind of done with his posse, so he goes with a prime minister. And he chooses Haman, and Haman is an Agagite, and he hates the Jewish population. He's a very prideful man that he would use his title to lord over people. And so when he was in the presence of his subjects, he would make them bow. And so this encounter happens between Esther's cousin Mordecai and Haman. And everybody around them bows to Haman except for Mordecai. And Haman just loses his mind. Have you ever been around a person who just like is really prideful? Like, do they just love themselves, and they want you to love them too? It's just like kind of that person. That's Haman. He just believes, it's almost like he's not prime minister, he's a little bit of deity, and you should bow to him. And so when Mordecai decides that he would only bow to the one true king and not to him, he loses his mind, and a plot is set forth. That he is going to not only take the life of Mordecai, but he's going to convince the king to wipe out all of the Jewish population. Can you imagine? And so he does just that. He sets up a gallows that would be what he would use to take Mordecai's life. At the same time, Mordecai hears the decree of what happens, that Haman had gone to the king and said, you need to wipe out all those people. And so carelessly, the king just says yes. The Bible doesn't really give any indication that they had a dialogue about it. He was like, that's fine. It's such a bizarre piece of scripture. So Haman takes the decree. He sends it to all 127 kingdoms. And when Mordecai finds out, he is so distraught that he tears his clothes, he pours ash over himself, and he just continues to lament. And one of Esther's servants sees Mordecai, runs to Esther and says, Mordecai is distraught. So Esther gives her servant clothes, says, take it back to Mordecai and comfort him. And Mordecai responds, you have to tell Esther she needs to stand in the gap for her people. She has to go to the king. If she does not go to the king, we'll be wiped out. And her response was then to tell the servant, go back to him and tell them that if I go to him, I'll die. That the only person that goes to a king is when they're summoned, and I haven't been summoned in over a month. What do you expect of me? And then Mordecai says these words to the servant. And this is what he replies to Esther. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this. See, Esther, she was at a crossroads, that she had to choose to lean into her fear and be paralyzed, or she would choose to have faith in her God, and she took action. And she began to pray. In fact, not only did she pray, her servants prayed and fasted with her. She gave word to Mordecai to pray and fast with her for the next day. And Mordecai gave word to a whole generation of Jews to fast and pray alongside her. You see, when fear tries to convince you that you're not enough, God says, I created you for such a time as this. That when God senses your fear, he doesn't just take your fear, he replaces it with love and wisdom. And that's where we find the queen. And there's a difference between the fear of God and fear itself. Fear itself says that God is not enough. So you have to take protection of yourself. You become your own God. The fear of God is a place of reverence. The fear of God is where you say you believe that not only is he worthy, but that he is able. And Esther feared the Lord more than she feared her king. And so she walks in wisdom. I love this. Chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, it says, on the third day of fasting and praying, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on the royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. Okay, this is the moment of truth. The moment of truth of how the king is going to respond, whether she will die or she will live. Verse 2. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, a sign that she would live. Now, I don't know about you, but can you remember a time where you became so fearful you did something just so cray-cray? Like just off the wall? Like when I get really fearful, I talk a lot. I say things I shouldn't say. Like I'm just trying to get out of it where you could just like almost make a fool of yourself. When I think of putting myself in Esther's shoes, the moment that I touch that scepter, I'd be like, okay, you need to know about Haman. He is a bad dude. You need to fire him. He's trying to take out my people. Like I would just be all kinds of words, right? And she doesn't. In fact, she leans into the wisdom of how she knows to get to the king's heart. And what she knows about the king is that he loves to celebrate. So she invites him to a banquet. It's brilliant. So they have this banquet, and the king asks, my queen, what is your request? Again, that's when I would just blurt it all out. And she says, I would like to invite you to another banquet tomorrow. And he's just elated. Now, while this is going on, Haman still is hatching his plan. He has brought the gallows into the presence of the palace in the front. He is so loud putting it up that once the first banquet is over, the first night, the king is trying to sleep, that he wakes up and he's like, what is that noise? And one of his servants says, oh, it's Haman out there setting up shop. And he's like, okay. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't ask who, for, or why. But he knows that he can't sleep. He feels so restless that he asks for some reading material, right? And he says, will you go get the historical accounts of my kingdom? And I just want to read. And as he's reading, he's reminded of this moment that Esther's cousin Mordecai had saved his life. There was a hatched plan for the king to be assassinated. Mordecai heard about it, told it to Esther, and the king was safe. He forgot all about it. So this is the best part of the whole entire passage. You have King Xerxes, who calls in Haman, the prime minister who's working on the gallows, to come in. And he asks him the simple question. He said, Haman, what should I do for someone who's been faithful to me? Someone who has been kind, who has been faithful, someone who saved my life. And you know who he's thinking he's talking about, right? He thinks he's talking about him. So Haman gives this lavish response. Oh, you should put him on your finest horse. And you should parade him through the whole entire city and have people shout out how awesome he is. Because that's what he wanted for himself. And then I think the best words of this whole entire book, King Xerxes replies, do that for Mordecai. Could you imagine his face like, homie say, what? You know, like it's this moment of humility. And so Esther hears what has happened. And so she doesn't just invite the king to the next banquet. She invites Haman. And then we pick up the story in chapter 5. In chapter 7, verse 3. It said, the queen answered the king after he had asked over and over again, what is your request? He said, she said, I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. So in one moment that she makes an ask of the king, she also declares that she is a Jew. So much risk, so much fear. So much riding on her moving past her fear, leaning into God to save an entire generation. And so he responds with such a powerful moment that he says, not only will I rip up the decree that says that all of your people will be annihilated, I will make a new one that will never be able to be revoked. You see, God replaces your fear with a spirit of power, with love and self-control. That God doesn't just take your fear, he replaces it. He empowers you. He gives you love. He gives you self-control. We saw that self-control all throughout Esther's time with the king. Listen what it says in 2 Timothy verse 1-7. It says, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of love and self-control." You see, when we choose faith in God over fears, we start looking at our circumstances, we start looking at our fears as an opportunity to exercise our faith. And so my question to you this morning as we close, what area of your life is God saying for such a time as this? What area of your life, when I say the word fear, seems to grip your heart? Whether you're in middle school or you're an empty nester, in the season of your life, where do you find you fight with fear? And what if God is saying, for such a time as this? And maybe for you, the fear is to forgive someone. And you fear that if you forgive that person, that they win. But what we've learned through the power of forgiveness is that they don't win, Christ wins. When you choose to give your fear over to God, transformation starts to take place. Maybe for you, it's the fear of quitting your job that is sucking the life out of you because your parents paid for your college education and you feel responsibility to your family, but you are so miserable day in and day out that the job is getting the best of you and your family is not, your friends are not. What if you decided to fear not, to lean in for such a time as this? And maybe for you, it's the fear of stepping into who you were called to be. And can I just talk to my middle schoolers this morning? Can I just say that God has positioned you perfectly to be who he called you to be? That no friendships, no amount of value placed on what you can do through sports, through academics, that God has designed you. And if you can get a hold of that truth, that God has created you for such a time of this, you will be set up to just succeed in ways you could never imagine in adulthood. You see, the person I am today is not the scared middle schooler I used to be. And it's not that I don't struggle with fear. I've just learned in my fear that we have a faithful God who not only takes it, but he returns it with a spirit of power, a spirit of sound mind, a God who promises that in our weakness, he is made strong.
And we'll rise up.